They outlawed the way humans fight, and then they went to war with them anyway. That was the moment the galaxy sealed its own fate. The transmission from the Galactic Council spread across 1,000 systems in less than a minute, cold, official, absolute. Human tactics were hereby declared violations of interstellar law. Psychological warfare, deceptive surrender, asymmetric strikes, adaptive command structures, all banned. Not discouraged, not regulated, erased. And yet, on the very edge of known space, the first human fleet had already crossed the border. No one stopped them, because no one believed they would actually fight that way again. If you're new to HFY Global Tales, stay with this story, because what happened next didn't just win a war. It changed how every species in the galaxy understood survival itself. And if you enjoy stories where humanity refuses to lose, make sure you're subscribed, because this one only gets darker from here. The council chambers on Vero Prime were silent as the final votes locked in. 12 dominant species, each older than humanity by centuries, had reached unanimous agreement. Humans were too dangerous, not because of their strength, not because of their technology, because of how they thought. They do not engage in honorable warfare, one counselor had said during deliberation. They manufacture confusion. They weaponize fear. They break formation intentionally, another added. They abandon logic mid-battle and replace it with improvisation. There is no pattern to predict. They fake weakness, a third voice warned. Then strike where no model anticipates. To them, this was chaos. To humanity, it was survival. So the council did what ancient powers always do when they cannot control something. They banned it. Every human-aligned system received the decree within seconds. All human military forces were ordered to immediately comply with standardized galactic combat doctrine, fixed formations, declared engagements, regulated escalation. War, according to the galaxy, was supposed to be predictable. But Earth had learned long ago, predictable wars are the ones you lose. At the edge of the Orion Expanse, Admiral Alara Vance stood on the bridge of the flagship Resolute Dawn, watching the Council's message replay in silence. Around her, officers exchanged uneasy glances, waiting for a reaction. She didn't give one, not immediately. Instead, she stepped forward, folding her hands behind her back as the stars stretched endlessly beyond the viewport. They finally did it, her second-in-command muttered. They outlawed us. A faint smile touched Alara's lips, but it wasn't amusement. It was recognition. They didn't outlaw us, she said quietly. They outlawed the only reason we've survived this long. The room fell still, because every human on that bridge understood exactly what she meant. Humanity had never been the strongest species. Their ships weren't the largest. Their weapons weren't the most advanced. But when pushed, when cornered, humans did something no other species in the galaxy could tolerate. They adapted faster than fear, and they weren't afraid to fight dirty. Orders, Admiral? The tactical officer asked. Alara turned slowly, her gaze sweeping across her crew. Forward the Council's directive to all ships, she said. Relief flickered briefly across a few faces. Then she finished. Then archive it under irrelevant. The relief vanished. In its place, something sharper. Understanding. Yes, Admiral, came the quiet reply. Across the fleet, the message spread. Not panic, not hesitation, acceptance. Because this wasn't new. Humanity had faced extinction before. Many times. And every time, survival hadn't come from following rules. It came from breaking them first. Hours later, the first contact was made. A coalition fleet, 3 times the size of a human force, emerged from hyperspace, perfectly aligned, perfectly ordered. Their ships formed precise geometric patterns, each movement synchronized according to Council doctrine. Predictable, safe, and completely unprepared. On the Resolute Dawn, sensors lit up with data streams as the enemy formation locked into engagement distance. Their broadcasting compliance protocols, the communications officer reported. They expect us to acknowledge regulated engagement terms. Alara didn't even look at the console. Do we look like we're here to negotiate? No, Admiral. Then don't answer. A pause. They're requesting formation alignment. Ilara exhaled slowly, almost thoughtfully. Good, she said. That means they still think this is a normal war. She turned toward tactical. Break formation. The order hit the bridge like a shockwave. Admiral, break formation, the officer repeated. Our ships will be exposed. Exactly. There it was. The first violation. Across the human fleet, tight defensive lines dissolved instantly. Ships scattered, not randomly, but not predictably either. Angles shifted. Speeds varied. Communication channels flooded with rapid, decentralized adjustments. To the coalition fleet, it looked like collapse. To humanity, it was the beginning. They're losing cohesion. One alien commander observed from across the battlefield. Maintain formation. They will destabilize themselves. But they didn't understand. Humans didn't need cohesion the way other species did. They needed freedom. And in that chaos, something terrifying emerged. Opportunity. Now, Ilara whispered. The scattered human ships surged not forward, but sideways, slipping between sensor-blind spots, exploiting tiny gaps in the enemy's perfect formation. Small strikes, precise hits, engines, communication relays, targeting arrays. Not enough to destroy, just enough to confuse. What are they doing? A coalition officer demanded, as their displays filled with inconsistent threat vectors. They're not targeting strategically, another replied. These attacks are inefficient. Ilara watched the battlefield unfold, her expression unchanged. They're waiting for a pattern, her second-in-command realized. Exactly, Ilara said softly, and we're not going to give them one. The second wave came seconds later. From behind, human ships that had seemingly retreated reappeared at impossible angles, striking again. Harder this time. Not coordinated, not symmetrical, unpredictable. The coalition fleet hesitated, just for a moment. But in war, a moment is all it takes. Enemy formation destabilizing. Tactical reported. They're attempting to adjust. Too late, Ilara said. And then, for the first time, she allowed herself to smile. Because the galaxy had made a critical mistake. They thought banning human tactics would stop humans from using them. But all it really did was ensure no one else would. The moment the first coalition ship broke formation, the galaxy began to understand its mistake. Not all at once, not clearly, but in fragments, sensor anomalies, delayed responses, misfired commands. Something was unraveling, and no one could explain why. Because from the outside, the human fleet still looked weaker, smaller, less organized, scattered across the battlefield like debris after an explosion. But that was the illusion. They are not maintaining tactical cohesion, a coalition strategist reported from the command ship Valyrian Spear. Recommend we hold formation and allow them to exhaust themselves. Across the command deck, agreement followed quickly. This was standard doctrine. When facing disorganized opposition, patience wins. Structure absorbs chaos. At least it was supposed to. Hold positions, the fleet commander ordered. Do not pursue. Let them collapse. And for a brief, fragile moment, it looked like the correct decision. On long-range scans, human ships drifted erratically. Some pulled back. Others accelerated in seemingly random directions. A few even powered down weapons entirely. Retreat, confusion, weakness. Everything the Council had warned about, contained. But aboard the Resolute Dawn, Admiral Ilara Vance saw something entirely different. They're watching, her intelligence officer said quietly. Trying to map us. Ilara nodded once. Of course they are. That's how they fight. Her eyes remained fixed on the shifting battlefield, tracking dozens of independent vectors at once. Then we give them something to map. A pause. Admiral? Ilara stepped closer to the central display. Repeat the maneuver, she said, but change the timing. Understanding rippled through the bridge crew. Because this wasn't just combat. It was manipulation. Across the human fleet, ships that had just engaged suddenly disengaged. Others surged forward, but slower this time. Angles shifted. Attack patterns overlapped inconsistently. Some vessels struck twice in rapid succession, while others waited just long enough to suggest hesitation. To the coalition observers, a pattern began to form. Imperfect, but real. They are stabilizing. One analyst aboard the Valerian Spear announced. We are identifying repetition in their movements. Finally, the commander replied. Predictive models? Compiling now. And that was exactly what Alara wanted. On her command, human ships began repeating certain maneuvers, not perfectly, but consistently enough to be noticed. The same approach vectors, the same retreat arcs, the same delay between strikes. Bait. They're building a model, Alara said. Her second-in-command frowned slightly. And we're helping them? For now. There was a subtle shift in her tone. Because once they trusted, she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Minutes passed. Data accumulated. Algorithms aboard coalition ships refined their predictions, growing more confident with every repeated movement. We have it, the coalition analyst confirmed. Human fleet behavior is irregular, but no longer random. We can anticipate their next engagement cycle. The commander leaned forward. Then we end this. Orders rippled outward. For the first time since the battle began, the coalition fleet moved, not defensively, but decisively. Their perfect formations adjusted with mathematical precision, aligning to intercept the predicted human vectors. It was flawless. It was inevitable. It was wrong. On the Resolute Dawn, the tactical officer's voice dropped. They're taking the bait. Alara exhaled slowly. Good. Her hand hovered over the command console for just a second. Then, break pattern. Everything changed. Human ships that had followed a consistent rhythm suddenly shattered it. Vectors reversed mid-approach. Retreating vessels accelerated forward. Time delays collapsed into simultaneous strikes. The pattern didn't evolve. It vanished. Coalition predictions failed instantly. What? The analyst stammered. They've deviated from all models. Recalculate, the commander snapped. We can't. There's no consistency. And that was the point. Across the battlefield, confusion spread like fire. Coalition ships, already mid-maneuver based on false predictions, found themselves out of position. Defensive alignments collapsed. Firing arcs misaligned. Entire sections of the fleet drifted into vulnerable gaps. And humanity was already moving to exploit them. They changed everything at once. The intelligence officer whispered on Alara's bridge. No, Alara corrected quietly. We removed the illusion that there was ever a correct way to read us. The second wave hit harder. Human ships surged through the fractures in enemy formation, striking deeper now, targeting command relays, coordination hubs, navigation cores. Not the biggest ships, the most important ones. They're dismantling our structure, a coalition officer shouted. Our formations are falling apart, the commander finished, his voice tightening. Because for the first time, they were the ones fighting without order. On the outskirts of the battlefield, a smaller coalition cruiser attempted to retreat, breaking from formation without authorization. Seconds later, two human ships intercepted it, not with overwhelming firepower, but with precision strikes that disabled engines and left the vessel drifting. Alive, but helpless. They're not destroying everything, one officer noted. They don't need to, another replied. Back on the Resolute Dawn, Alara watched the cruiser spin slowly on the edge of the fight. Leave it, she ordered. Her second-in-command glanced at her. Admiral, that ship could rejoin the fight. No, Alara said. It won't. A beat. Why? Alara's eyes didn't leave the drifting vessel. Because now they're afraid. And fear, in human warfare, was never an accident. It was a weapon. Across coalition channels, fragmented reports began to spread. Unpredictable attacks, broken formations, ships appearing where they shouldn't be. No clear front line, no safe position. They're not fighting like any known species. One transmission crackled. There are no rules, no logic. Another cut in. They're everywhere. We can't track them. And then, the one message that echoed louder than the rest. We cannot predict them. On the Valerian Spear, silence fell over the command deck. Because that sentence, that single realization, changed everything. Predictability was the foundation of galactic warfare. Every tactic, every formation, every engagement protocol relied on it. Without it, strategy collapsed. And without strategy, there was only reaction. The commander straightened slowly, his earlier confidence gone. "Signal all units," he said, voice controlled but strained. "Adapt. Break formation if necessary. We will not be outmaneuvered by disorder." But it was already too late, because humans had spent centuries mastering something the rest of the galaxy had spent centuries avoiding: fighting without certainty. On the resolute dawn, Ilara finally turned away from the battlefield display. "They're starting to understand," her second-in-command said. "Yes," Ilara replied. A pause. "Will it help them?" Ilara's expression didn't change. No. Her gaze shifted back to the stars, where human ships moved like fragments of a storm, impossible to track, impossible to contain. "Because by the time you understand how we fight," her voice dropped, calm and absolute, "you've already lost to it." The second the coalition fleet tried to adapt, they broke their own laws. And that was when everything truly began to collapse. At first, it was subtle. A single cruiser drifting out of alignment without authorization. A defensive wing adjusting its spacing beyond regulated parameters. A commander issuing an unsanctioned maneuver to compensate for human unpredictability. Small things. Necessary things. Illegal things. On the command deck of the Valyrian Spear, warning signals began to flash, not from damage reports, but from internal compliance systems. "Multiple units are deviating from Council doctrine," an officer reported, voice tight. "Formation integrity is compromised across 3 sectors." The commander didn't respond immediately, because for the first time since the battle began, he understood the trap. "They forced this," he said quietly. No one asked what he meant. They all knew. Humans hadn't just attacked their fleet. They had attacked their rules. "Reinforce discipline," the commander ordered sharply. "All units return to regulated formation immediately. No exceptions." "But sir," the analyst hesitated. "If we do that, we become predictable again." "I am aware." A pause. "And if we don't," the officer pressed. The commander's jaw tightened. "Then we become them." Silence followed. Because, to the coalition, that was worse. Across the battlefield, the order went out. Ships began pulling back into structured formations, re-establishing symmetry, restoring the clean geometric patterns that defined galactic warfare. And for a moment, the chaos slowed. Human ships, still scattered, seemed to hesitate, just long enough to be noticed. "They're reacting," one coalition officer said, a hint of hope returning. "Our structure is stabilizing the field." But aboard the Resolute Dawn, Admiral Ilara Vance saw the truth. "They're retreating into the cage," she said. Her tactical officer blinked. "Cage." Ilara nodded toward the display. "Look at them. Every ship moving exactly where it's supposed to be. Every response dictated by protocol." Understanding spread across the bridge like a quiet shock. "They're predictable again," someone whispered. Ilara's expression hardened slightly. More than that. She stepped forward, her voice steady. "They're limited. And limitation in war was death." "Signal all units," she said. Across the human fleet, encrypted channels lit up. "This is Admiral Vance. Authorization granted for full-spectrum tactical deviation." A pause. Then she added the words the Council had forbidden. "Use everything." On dozens of ships, human commanders exchanged glances, not of hesitation, but of recognition. This was it. The line they were never supposed to cross again. And they crossed it without a second thought. The first violation hit like a whisper. A human frigate, heavily damaged and drifting near the edge of the battlefield, suddenly broadcast a surrender signal. Weapons powered down. Engines offline. Hull integrity critical. Standard protocol demanded response. A coalition escort vessel adjusted course, moving to secure the disabled ship. "They are complying," the escort captain reported, preparing to board. On the Resolute Dawn, Ilara didn't speak. She didn't need to. 3 seconds before docking range, the human frigate's engines ignited. Not forward. Sideways. The sudden burst of motion threw off targeting locks as hidden weapon ports opened along its hull. Point-blank range, full discharge. The escort vessel didn't even have time to raise shields. It vanished in a flash of light. Across coalition channels, shock rippled instantly. They fake surrender. Violation of engagement law. Impossible, no species would. But humanity would, and humanity did. That's one, Ilara murmured. The second violation came moments later. A cluster of human fighters broke off from the main engagement, fleeing at maximum speed away from the battlefield. Retreat. Cowardice. Coalition interceptors pursued immediately, confident in their superior speed and firepower. They're running, an interceptor pilot reported. We'll eliminate them quickly. They never finished the sentence. Because the moment the interceptors reached optimal range, the human fighters split apart. Not randomly, perfectly. Each ship veering off at calculated angles, drawing the interceptors into a widening net. From behind, cloaked human vessels decloaked simultaneously, cutting off every escape route. The hunters had become the trapped. "What is this?" one interceptor pilot shouted as targeting systems lit up from all sides. The answer came in a storm of coordinated fire. No survivors. "That's two," Ilara said. On the coalition flagship, the commander stared at the incoming reports, disbelief giving way to something colder. "They are deliberately violating every law," he said. "No," the analyst corrected weakly. "They're using them against us." And that was worse, because every rule the coalition followed, every limitation they obeyed, became a weakness humans could exploit. "They fake surrender, we respond with protocol," the analyst continued. "They retreat, we pursue according to doctrine. Every action we take is predictable." The commander's hands clenched behind his back. "Then we stop following the rules." The words felt wrong the moment he said them, because that meant abandoning everything their civilization believed about warfare. Honor, structure, control. But as another wave of human strikes tore through their outer defenses, the choice became clear. "Signal all units," he ordered. A pause. Then, reluctantly, authorization granted for adaptive engagement. The words echoed across the fleet like a fracture spreading through glass. But it didn't save them, because humanity wasn't just breaking the rules. They were faster at it. On the resolute dawn, Ilara listened to intercepted transmissions as coalition forces began to loosen their formations, attempting to mimic human unpredictability. Her second-in-command looked almost impressed. "They're learning." Ilara shook her head slightly. "No, a beat. They're copying." She turned back to the battlefield. And copying is always slower than understanding. The difference became clear within minutes. Coalition ships attempted irregular maneuvers, but hesitated at critical moments. Their movements lacked the instinct, the speed, the absolute commitment humans had developed over centuries of chaotic warfare. They tried to be unpredictable, but they still thought in patterns. And humans saw every one of them. "Now," Ilara said. The third wave began. This time, there was no illusion, no bait, no hesitation. Human ships surged forward from every direction at once, not in formation, but in intent. Each vessel acting independently, yet somehow aligned toward a single outcome: collapse. Coalition lines fractured under the pressure. Ships collided. Commands overlapped. Defensive grids failed to synchronize. For the first time in the battle, the coalition fleet wasn't just losing. It was unraveling. On the Valyrian Spear, alarms blared continuously as damage reports flooded in. "We're losing coordination across all sectors. Command relays are down. Multiple units are acting without orders." The commander gripped the console, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Stabilize the fleet. Regain." He stopped, because there was nothing left to stabilize. The structure was gone, and without structure, they had nothing. Far across the battlefield, the drifting human frigate, the one that had faked surrender, powered down once more, silent among the wreckage. A message transmitted quietly across open channels. Not to command, not to allies, to everyone. "We warned you. On the resolute dawn, Ilara closed her eyes for just a second. Not in relief, in certainty, because the galaxy had made its choice. They outlawed the way humans fight. And now, they were learning why those tactics existed in the first place, to be why the time the coalition realized the battle was no longer controlled, it was already too late to regain control. Because chaos, once unleashed, doesn't just spread, it evolves. Across the battlefield, the once perfect formation of the coalition fleet had dissolved into fragments. Isolated clusters of ships trying to coordinate, trying to survive, trying to understand what they were facing. But understanding required time, and humans never gave them any. They're no longer acting as a unified force. The intelligence officer reported aboard the Resolute Dawn. Command signals are overlapping. Some units are retreating while others are advancing. Ilara Vance watched the data scroll across her display, her expression calm, focused. "Good," she said quietly. Her second-in-command glanced at her. "We've broken their formation. Do we push for total destruction?" Ilara didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stepped closer to the projection, a shifting storm of signals, trajectories, and dying ships. "No," she said finally. A pause. "We make it worse." Confusion flickered across a few faces. "Admiral?" Ilara turned slightly, her voice steady. "They're already losing the battle. That's not enough." Her gaze hardened. "We need them to lose their ability to fight anything like this ever again." And that meant one thing: fear reinforced by experience. "Signal all units," she ordered. "Phase shift." The command spread instantly. And across the scattered human fleet, something changed. Up until now, their chaos had been controlled, calculated unpredictability, precise disorder. But now, they escalated. Human ships began executing maneuvers that defied every known combat model in the galaxy. Sudden engine bursts at impossible angles. Weapons firing mid-rotation. Ships accelerating directly into crossfire, only to veer away at the last possible moment. It didn't look tactical. It looked insane. "They're colliding with their own vectors," a coalition officer shouted, watching human ships pass within meters of each other at lethal speeds. "They're going to destroy themselves." But they didn't, because every movement, every near miss, every impossible turn was intentional. "They're using proximity as concealment," another officer realized too late. "Our targeting systems can't lock properly when they move like this." And that was just the beginning. On the edges of the battlefield, damaged human ships, ones that should have retreated, suddenly surged back into combat, acting as distractions, decoys, even shields for more intact vessels. "They're sacrificing units," a coalition strategist said, stunned. "No species would willingly." "They're not sacrificing," the commander interrupted, voice low. "They're choosing." Because that was the difference. Humans didn't see war as a sequence of acceptable losses. They saw it as a series of decisions, and they made them faster than anyone else. On the Resolute Dawn, Ilara monitored the shifting chaos with quiet precision. "Deploy signal ghosts," she said. Her communications officer nodded immediately. Within seconds, dozens, then hundreds of false signals flooded the battlefield. Phantom ships appeared on coalition sensors, mimicking human signatures, moving in impossible patterns. "They're multiplying," a coalition analyst stammered. "We're detecting more human vessels than physically possible." "Sensor interference?" another suggested. "No, the signals are too consistent." And that was the trap. Because while coalition forces tried to distinguish real targets from illusions, they stopped reacting to both. "They're hesitating," Ilara noted. Her second-in-command nodded slowly. "They don't trust their own data anymore." Exactly. And in war, hesitation is fatal. The next human strike wasn't larger. It was quieter. A small group of human corvettes slipped through the confusion, using the phantom signals as cover. No dramatic maneuvers, no chaotic bursts, just silence. They passed through what remained of the coalition's outer defenses without resistance, because no one saw them. Minutes later, the first command relay station went dark. Then another, then another. "They're targeting our coordination network," a coalition officer shouted. If we lose central command? The lights flickered across the Valyrian sphere. For a brief, terrifying moment, everything went silent. No incoming data. No outgoing commands. No structure. Then chaos returned, but worse than before. Units are acting independently, someone yelled. We've lost synchronized control. The commander stood frozen, staring at the fractured battlefield. Because now, they weren't a fleet anymore. They were individuals. And individuals couldn't survive against something like this. On the resolute dawn, Ilara finally allowed herself to sit. They've crossed the threshold, she said. Her second-in-command frowned slightly. Threshold. Ilara gestured toward the display. Up until now, they were trying to win. A beat. Now they're trying to understand what's happening. Another pause. And that means they've already lost. Across the battlefield, coalition ships began to scatter, not as a tactic, but as a reaction. Some attempted retreat. Others fired blindly at phantom targets. A few even powered down, hoping to avoid detection entirely. It didn't matter, because humanity wasn't just attacking their ships anymore. They were attacking their confidence. They're breaking psychologically, the intelligence officer observed. Ilara nodded once. That was always the objective. Because a destroyed fleet can be rebuilt, but a terrified one? That lingers. A coalition cruiser, heavily damaged and drifting, suddenly opened a wideband transmission, uncoded, desperate. We cannot fight this, the voice said, trembling. They are not bound by logic. They do not follow. The transmission cut abruptly as the ship was struck from an unseen angle. Silence followed, not just on the battlefield, across every listening channel, because everyone heard it, everyone understood it. They're spreading fear on open frequencies, the communications officer said quietly. Ilara didn't look surprised. Of course they are, she replied. Her voice was calm, measured. They want the rest of the galaxy to hear this. And they would. Because this wasn't just a battle anymore. It was a demonstration, a message, a warning. The coalition had outlawed human tactics to make war safer, more controlled, more predictable. But in doing so, they removed the only framework that could contain what humanity had become. On the edges of the battlefield, the remaining coalition ships began pulling back, not in formation, not in strategy, in fear. They're retreating, tactical confirmed. Ilara watched them go, her expression unreadable. Let them, she said. Her second-in-command blinked. We're not pursuing? Ilara shook her head slightly. No. A pause. They need to survive this. Confusion lingered for a second. Then understanding followed. Because survivors tell stories, and those stories travel faster than any fleet. Ilara leaned back, her gaze fixed on the fading signals of the retreating enemy. They wanted to outlaw how we fight, she said softly. Her voice carried across the quiet bridge. So we showed them what happens when you don't. The battlefield behind them burned in silence, wreckage drifting, signals fading, chaos slowly settling into aftermath. But the real impact had only just begun. The first battle didn't end when the shooting stopped. It ended when the stories started spreading. Across the galaxy, fragmented transmissions from the shattered coalition fleet reached distant systems hours before any official report. Broken signals, distorted voices, partial recordings, but they all carried the same message. Fear. They don't follow rules. They fake surrender. They attack from nowhere. We couldn't predict them. The words repeated, overlapping across channels, growing louder with every relay. By the time the first survivors reached Allied space, the damage was already done. Because information travels faster than fleets, and fear travels faster than information. On Viral Prime, inside the high chamber of the Galactic Council, the atmosphere had changed. Silence still filled the room, but it was no longer confident. Their exaggerations, one counselor insisted, though the certainty in their voice had begun to crack. Battle stress, disorientation. The human fleet was smaller, contained. Another projection flickered to life, raw footage this time. A human ship drifting, powerless, then suddenly accelerating into point-blank destruction. Coalition vessels firing at empty space. Phantom signals flooding sensors. The chamber dimmed as the recording ended. No one spoke immediately. They violated the law, a third counselor said at last, as if clinging to the only thing that still made sense. They ignored it, another corrected quietly. And that distinction mattered more than any of them wanted to admit. Because a law only works if it's followed. And humanity had never agreed to survive by permission. They cannot be allowed to continue this, the first counselor said, regaining some force. If these tactics spread, every conflict in the galaxy will descend into chaos. They already have, a quieter voice replied. All eyes turned. A junior observer, one not meant to speak in such chambers, stood frozen under the attention. Reports are coming in from border systems, they continued, voice unsteady. Independent fleets are already adjusting their doctrines. Some are attempting to imitate human tactics. A ripple of unease moved through the chamber. They won't succeed, a senior counselor snapped. Those methods require a level of unpredictability most species cannot sustain. Maybe, the observer said softly. A pause. But they don't need to succeed. The room fell still again, because even partial chaos was still chaos. Far from the council, deep in contested space, the remnants of the coalition fleet regrouped near a fractured star system. Dozens of ships, damaged, scattered, barely functional, hovered in loose proximity. Not formation, just survival. They're not pursuing us, one officer said, almost confused. Why? Another asked. No one had an answer. Because retreat was supposed to trigger pursuit. It was expected, predictable, safe to assume. But humans hadn't followed. And that made it worse. On the bridge of the Valyrian Spear, the fleet commander stood in silence, watching repair drones move across his ship's hull. They let us go, his second-in-command said quietly. The commander didn't turn. I know. A beat. Do you think it was mercy? The commander's jaw tightened. No. Another pause. It was intentional. Because deep down, he understood exactly what the humans had done. They want us to talk, he said. And they would. Across every system they returned to, every port they docked in, every command center they reported to. The survivors carried more than damage reports. They carried experience. And experience couldn't be dismissed as easily as data. They moved without patterns. They broke every engagement rule. They turned our own responses against us. The same phrases repeated, again and again and again, until doubt began to take root. At first, it was subtle, a hesitation before engaging human ships, a delay in executing standard protocols, a quiet question in the back of every commander's mind. What if the rules don't work anymore? And that question was far more dangerous than any weapon. Back aboard the Resolute Dawn, the human fleet drifted in controlled silence as repairs and recalibrations continued. The battle was over, but the war had only just begun. They're spreading the story faster than we expected, the communications officer reported. Alara Vance nodded slightly. They will, she said. Fear doesn't need accuracy. It just needs repetition. Her second-in-command leaned against the console, watching incoming transmissions scroll past. Some of them are already trying to adapt, he noted. We're picking up fragmented attempts to mimic our tactics. Ilara's expression didn't change. They won't do it right. Does that matter? A brief pause. No, because imperfect chaos was still disruptive enough, and humanity knew how to navigate it better than anyone else. They've already lost control of the battlefield, Ilara continued. Now they're losing control of themselves. Outside the viewport, damaged ships slowly reformed into loose operational clusters, not rigid formations, but flexible groupings. Human fleets didn't rebuild structure. They rebuilt function. What's our next move? Her second-in-command asked. Ilara looked out at the stars, her reflection faint against the glass. We wait. A beat. They'll come back. After what just happened, he asked. Ilara's voice was calm. They don't have a choice. Because the Council couldn't allow this to stand. If humanity proved that unpredictable warfare worked, if it became the new standard, Then every controlled system in the galaxy would destabilize. Trade routes would become unsafe. Borders would become meaningless. Power would become uncertain. They'll send a larger fleet, Ilara said. Stronger, more prepared. Her eyes narrowed slightly, and more afraid. And fear, as humanity understood better than anyone, could be shaped. Days later, the next transmission arrived. Not broken, not panicked, official. The Galactic Council had authorized a full-scale counteroffensive. Multiple fleets, unified command, reinforced doctrine. A war meant to restore order. They're doubling down, the tactical officer said. Ilara nodded once. Good. A pause. They think this is about winning a battle. Her gaze hardened, distant but focused. It never was. Because humanity wasn't just fighting ships. They were fighting an idea. The belief that war could be controlled. That conflict could be predictable. That survival could be regulated. And one battle was never going to be enough to break that. They're coming back with everything, her second-in-command said. Ilara finally turned away from the stars. Then we make sure they understand, she replied. Her voice dropped, quiet, steady, absolute. Everything isn't enough. Far across the galaxy, fleets began to mobilize. Massive armadas, coordinated with precision, moving toward a single objective. End humanity's defiance. Restore order. Reinforce the law. But as those fleets prepared for war, the stories had already reached them. And no matter how disciplined they were, no matter how structured their formations, there was one thing they couldn't remove. The thought, the doubt, the fear. Because somewhere, deep in every command deck, a single question echoed. What happens when the enemy doesn't play by the rules? And this time, they already knew the answer. The second fleet was larger, stronger, perfect. And that was exactly why it was going to lose. It arrived in absolute silence. Thousands of ships dropping out of hyperspace in flawless synchronization, their formation stretching across the void like a living structure of steel and light. Every angle precise, every distance calculated, every response pre-planned. No hesitation, no confusion, no weakness. They learned, the tactical officer said quietly aboard the Resolute Dawn. Admiral Ilara Vance stood at the center of the bridge, watching the incoming armada without expression. Yes, she said. A pause. They learned just enough to be dangerous. Her second-in-command frowned. Dangerous to us? Ilara shook her head slightly. No, a beat. To themselves. Because this time, the coalition fleet wasn't just following the rules. They were enforcing them. They've tightened their formations, the intelligence officer reported. Layered defenses, overlapping fire arcs, synchronized movement across all sectors. Redundant command relays, another added. Even if we disrupt one, others will compensate. Ilara nodded once. They're trying to remove uncertainty. Her gaze remained fixed on the vast formation ahead. They think that's the solution. And that was the problem. Because uncertainty wasn't something you removed in war. It was something you used. Signal all units, Ilara said calmly. The bridge fell silent. Because her tone had changed. Not louder, not sharper, just final. This operation proceeds as planned. Her second-in-command hesitated. Admiral, we're really doing this? Ilara turned slightly, meeting his eyes. They banned how we fight. A pause. So we're going to show them why we built it this way. Across the human fleet, a single command spread. Encrypted, confirmed, irreversible. And then, humanity pulled back. On coalition sensors, the entire human fleet began retreating at once. Engines flared. Vectors aligned, away from the battlefield, away from engagement range. They're withdrawing, a coalition analyst reported. Suspicion flickered briefly across the command deck of the flagship Valyrian Spear. Is it another deception? One officer asked. The fleet commander watched the data streams carefully. No, he said slowly. This is different. Because it was. The retreat wasn't chaotic. It was clean, structured, almost compliant. They're following regulated disengagement protocols, the analyst confirmed. Confusion creeping into their voice. They're obeying the law. A ripple of cautious optimism spread across the coalition fleet. They've realized they can't win like this, another officer suggested. Maintain formation, the commander ordered. Do not pursue recklessly. We will advance under controlled engagement. The massive fleet began moving forward, steady, disciplined, unshaken. And for the first time since the war began, they believed they understood humanity. On the resolute dawn, the bridge was quiet. "They're taking it," the communications officer said softly. Alara nodded. "Of course they are." Her second-in-command crossed his arms, watching the human fleet continue its retreat. "They think we're surrendering." Alara's lips curved slightly, not into a smile, but something colder. "They think we finally started playing by their rules." A beat. "We haven't." Because this wasn't surrender. It was positioning. Hours passed. The human fleet continued to fall back, deeper into the system, toward a region of space marked by unstable gravitational readings and scattered debris fields. "They're leading us somewhere," one coalition officer noted. "Stay disciplined," the commander replied. "We maintain formation." And they did, perfectly, which meant they never questioned it. "They're entering a high-density debris zone," the analyst reported. "Navigation risk is increasing." "Adjust course slightly," the commander ordered. "Maintain structural integrity." The fleet shifted just enough to remain safe, just enough to remain predictable. And that was when the trap closed. On the resolute dawn, Alara's voice cut through the silence. Now, the human fleet stopped retreating. Instantly. No gradual slowdown. No transition. 1 second they were fleeing. The next, they turned. Every ship, at once. Coalition sensors struggled to keep up as thousands of human vessels reversed vectors simultaneously, accelerating back toward the advancing armada. "What?" the analyst stammered. "They've stopped retreating. Recalculate intercept patterns." But it was already too late, because the battlefield wasn't empty anymore. It never had been. "They've been seeding the area," Alara's intelligence officer said, watching hidden signals activate across the debris field. Mines, drones, signal disruptors, hundreds, no thousands. They turned the entire retreat path into a weapon, the second-in-command realized. The first explosions lit up the void. Not massive, not dramatic, precise, targeted. Coalition ships at the front of the formation struck invisible triggers, detonating localized bursts that disrupted shields, sensors, and propulsion systems. Chain reactions followed. Ships collided, formations broke, and still, the rest of the fleet kept moving forward, because their doctrine demanded it. "They can't stop fast enough," the tactical officer whispered. Alara nodded. They committed too early. That was the trap. The retreat wasn't meant to deceive them into chasing blindly. It was meant to lock them into a decision. Advance. Maintain formation. Trust the system. And now, they couldn't undo it. "Emergency course correction," the coalition commander shouted. "Break formation, avoid." But the order came too late, because breaking formation now meant breaking it inside a minefield. Ships veered off course, only to trigger more hidden devices. Others tried to hold position, colliding with damaged vessels drifting into their path. The perfect formation collapsed into chaos. Again, but this time, it was worse, because they had walked into it willingly. "They're hurting us," an officer realized, panic creeping into their voice. "Every movement we make triggers another." Another explosion cut the sentence short. On the resolute dawn, Alara watched the battlefield ignite with controlled precision. "They built their entire strategy around control," she said quietly. A pause. "So we gave them something they couldn't control." The second phase began. Human ships surged forward, not recklessly, but with terrifying clarity. They navigated the debris field effortlessly, weaving through hazards they had placed themselves, striking isolated coalition ships trapped in the chaos. "They know exactly where everything is," the tactical officer said. "Of course we do," Alara replied. Her eyes remained fixed on the collapsing enemy fleet. "We build it." Across the battlefield, coalition command structures failed again, overwhelmed not just by human tactics, but by their own inability to adapt fast enough. They're collapsing faster than the First Fleet, the intelligence officer reported. Alara nodded once. They prepared for us. A beat. They didn't prepare for this. Because this wasn't just unpredictability. This was inevitability. The trap had been set long before the battle began. The retreat, the positioning, the seeded battlefield, all of it leading to this single moment. And now, there was no escape. On the Valyrian spear, the commander stared at the unfolding disaster, his voice barely audible. They turned the battlefield itself against us. No one responded, because there was nothing left to say. Far ahead, human ships moved like guided strikes through a collapsing system, dismantling what remained of the coalition fleet piece by piece. Not rushing, not hesitating, finishing. On the resolute dawn, Alara finally spoke again. They wanted a war with rules, she said softly. Her gaze never wavered. So we gave them one. A pause. Just not the kind they expected. Outside, the battlefield burned. Controlled chaos consuming structured order, exactly as planned. And in that moment, the galaxy began to realize something far worse than fear. Understanding. Because this wasn't random. This wasn't reckless. This wasn't luck. This was design. And that meant humanity hadn't just broken the rules of war. They had replaced them. By the time the Second Fleet began to collapse, the galaxy stopped asking how to win and started asking how to survive. Because what humanity had done inside that debris field wasn't just a victory. It was proof. Proof that every rule the galaxy depended on could be turned into a weakness. On Viral Prime, the Galactic Council reconvened under emergency authority. No ceremony, no delay, just urgency, and something far more dangerous beneath it. Uncertainty. They walked into it, one counselor said, watching the reconstructed battle feed. They had full sensor coverage, full predictive modeling, and they followed protocol. Another interrupted. A pause. And that's why they lost. Silence followed, because no one could argue with it anymore. Every ship that had been destroyed had done exactly what it was supposed to do. Every commander had followed doctrine. Every system had performed as designed. And it had all failed. They're exploiting compliance, a strategist said quietly. Every time we act according to law, they anticipate it. Then we stop acting according to law, another counselor snapped. The room shifted uneasily, because that suggestion was unthinkable. The entire galactic order was built on regulated conflict, predictable engagement, controlled escalation. Remove that, and war becomes something else, something far more dangerous. Without doctrine, one elder voice said slowly, we lose control. Another voice answered just as quietly, we already have. Far from the council, scattered fleets across the galaxy began receiving updated directives. Contradictory, fragmented, uncertain. Maintain formation. Break formation if necessary. Follow engagement law. Adapt at your discretion. It didn't make sense. And that was the problem. Because confusion at the highest level becomes chaos everywhere else. On the front lines, smaller coalition fleets began encountering human forces again. But this time, something had changed. They hesitated. They're not engaging immediately. A human sensor officer reported aboard the Resolute Dawn. Enemy fleet holding position at long range. Alara Vance studied the display. They're thinking, she said. Her second-in-command frowned. That's new. Yes, Alara replied. A pause. And it won't help them. Because thinking required certainty. And humans had removed that. Across the void, the coalition fleet shifted slightly. Its formation less rigid than before, but still structured. Still controlled. Still trying. Their testing responses, the intelligence officer observed. Small movements. Probing maneuvers. Alara nodded once. They're looking for rules. A faint, almost invisible smile touched her lips. They won't find any. She turned to tactical. Mirror them. Confusion flickered. Mirror? Match their movements, Alara clarified. Exactly. The order spread. And, across the human fleet, something unusual happened. They slowed down. No sudden bursts. No chaotic maneuvers. No unpredictable strikes. Just reflection. When the coalition fleet adjusted position, humans adjusted the same way. When they advanced slightly, humans matched it. Distance remained constant. Tension built. They're copying us, a coalition officer said, unsettled. Why aren't they attacking? Because they're waiting, another replied. But waiting for what? Minutes passed. Then more. The battlefield remained locked in a strange, silent dance. Two fleets moving in synchronized patterns, neither committing, neither retreating. Until finally, the coalition made a decision. They're not engaging, the fleet commander said, which means they're uncertain. A beat. We push forward. Orders were issued. The fleet advanced, slowly at first, then with increasing confidence, as human forces continued to mirror their movements without resistance. They're backing down, an officer said. They've lost initiative, another added. On the resolute dawn, Ilara watched the advance without reaction. They think we're hesitating, her second-in-command said. Ilara nodded. Good. A pause. Keep mirroring. The coalition fleet pushed deeper, their formation tightening slightly as confidence returned. They're regaining structure, the intelligence officer warned. Ilara's gaze didn't shift. Not for long. Because the moment they believed they understood the situation, they would commit. And commitment was the point of no return. They're preparing full engagement, Tactical reported. Weapon systems charging across multiple sectors. Ilara exhaled slowly. Of course they are. Her voice dropped. They think this is their moment. A beat. It is. But not in the way they expected. Signal all units, she said. The bridge went still. Because everyone recognized that tone. The shift. The edge. They've been trying to adapt to us, Ilara continued. Trying to think like us. Her eyes hardened slightly. So we're going to show them why that doesn't work. Across the human fleet, the mirroring stopped. Instantly. No transition. No warning. 1 second, perfect synchronization. The next, complete divergence. Human ships split apart in every direction, accelerating into positions the coalition fleet had just exposed during their advance. Gaps opened instantly, gaps the coalition had created themselves. They've broken formation. A coalition officer shouted. No, another corrected, panic rising. We did, because every adjustment they had made, every movement they had chosen, had been observed, copied, learned, and now exploited. They used our own behavior against us, the commander said, realization hitting too late. On the resolute dawn, Ilara's voice was calm. They always do. The attack hit harder than anything before, not because of scale, but because of precision. Human ships struck exactly where the coalition fleet was weakest, not by chance, not by guesswork, but by design. Every vulnerability had been revealed during the mirroring phase. They mapped us, the intelligence officer said quietly. Yes, Ilara replied. A pause. And we let them. Coalition defenses collapsed faster this time, not from confusion, but from inevitability. Every countermeasure had already been anticipated. Every adjustment already accounted for. They can't recover, Tactical reported. Ilara nodded once. They committed. And commitment against an enemy like this was fatal. Across the battlefield, coalition ships attempted to retreat, but their escape paths had already been cut off. Maneuvering space reduced. Options limited. They're trapped, someone whispered. Ilara didn't respond, because this wasn't a trap built for minds or deception. This was something else. They're trapped by their own decisions, her second-in-command said quietly. Ilara finally looked at him. Exactly, because that was the real evolution of human warfare. Not just breaking rules, not just creating chaos, but turning the enemy's choices into weapons. The final coalition signals began to fracture, orders overlapping, commands contradicting, structure dissolving once again. But this time, there was no confusion about why. They understood. Too late. They tried to fight like us, the intelligence officer said. Ilara's gaze returned to the battlefield, her voice steady. No, a beat. They tried to fight against us. And that was the mistake. Because you couldn't out-adapt a species that had built its entire survival on adaptation. Outside, the last remnants of the Coalition fleet began to fall apart, system by system, ship by ship. Not because they lacked strength, but because they lacked freedom. They bound themselves to rules, Ilara said softly. Her voice carried across the silent bridge. And then they tried to break them. A pause. That hesitation cost them everything. The battlefield dimmed as the final resistance collapsed. And across the galaxy, the realization spread. It wasn't just that human tactics were dangerous. It was that following rules against them was fatal to be why the time the third wave of fleets collapsed, the war stopped feeling like a war. It felt like a lesson, and the entire galaxy was failing it. There were no more clean engagements, no more balanced conflicts, no more predictable outcomes. Every new fleet that entered contested space carried not just weapons, but hesitation. They're slowing their advances, the intelligence officer reported aboard the Resolute Dawn. Coalition fleets are maintaining extreme distance before engagement. Ilara Vance stood in silence, watching the tactical display fill with cautious movements, delayed reactions, and fragmented formations. They're afraid to commit, her second-in-command said. Ilara nodded slightly. Good. A pause. That means they're thinking about us instead of the battlefield. And that shift changed everything. Because war wasn't just about firepower. It was about focus. And the Coalition had lost theirs. Across multiple sectors, human fleets began pushing forward, not aggressively, not recklessly, but steadily. Controlled pressure. Measured advances. No sudden chaos. Not yet. They're not using the same tactics, one Coalition commander observed from a distant front. Human movements are structured. Is this a new doctrine? Another asked. No, the first replied, uncertainty creeping into their voice. It's worse. Because this time, humanity looked predictable. On the Resolute Dawn, the shift was intentional. Maintain formation, Ilara ordered. Her tactical officer hesitated. Admiral formation? Yes. The word felt almost foreign on a human bridge. But the fleet obeyed. Ships aligned. Distances regulated. Movement synchronized. Order. For the first time in the war, humanity looked like every other species in the galaxy. They won't expect this, her second-in-command said quietly. Ilara's gaze remained steady. They won't trust it. And that was the point. Across the battlefield, Coalition sensors locked onto the human formation. They're aligning with standard doctrine, an analyst reported. Clean structure, predictable vectors. Suspicion rippled instantly. It's a trap, one officer said. It has to be, another added. Hold position, the commander ordered. We do not engage until we confirm. Minutes passed. Then more. Human ships continued forward, calm, precise, disciplined. No sudden breaks. No erratic maneuvers. No chaos. They're maintaining it, the analyst said. No deviation detected. The Coalition commander leaned forward slightly. Test them. A small group of Coalition ships advanced cautiously, probing the human formation's response. On the Resolute Dawn, hold, Ilara said. The human fleet didn't react. No sudden shift. No counterattack. Just continued movement. They're not responding, the intelligence officer said. Her second-in-command frowned. This goes against everything we've shown them. Ilara nodded. Exactly. Across the void, the Coalition probe moved closer. Still no reaction. They're either disciplined or baiting us, the commander muttered. Another pause. They're making us choose. And that choice was the real battlefield. They want us to hesitate, an officer said. And we are, another replied. Silence settled across the command deck. Because hesitation had already cost them before. But so had rushing in. There is no correct answer, the analyst whispered. And that was the realization, the breaking point. Because war, as the galaxy understood it, was built on correct answers, predictable outcomes, controlled risks. Humanity had removed all of it. They've turned every option into a liability, the commander said slowly. On the Resolute Dawn, Ilara watched the Coalition fleet stall in place. They're stuck, her second-in-command said. Yes, Ilara replied. A beat. They can't move forward, and they can't stay where they are. Because either choice could be wrong. And without certainty, they froze. Begin Phase 2, Ilara ordered. Across the human fleet, something subtle shifted. Not chaos. Not yet. Just pressure. Ships at the edges of the formation began adjusting slightly. Barely noticeable changes. Angles shifting. Speeds altering by fractions. To human eyes, it was nothing. To coalition sensors, it was everything. They're changing again, an analyst said, tension rising. Micro adjustments across the entire formation. What does it mean? The commander demanded. No answer came. Because there wasn't one. They're creating ambiguity, someone finally said. And ambiguity was the most dangerous thing of all. Because it forced interpretation. And interpretation led to mistakes. They're going to break formation, one officer guessed. No, they're setting up another trap. They're waiting for us to react. Conflicting analyses flooded the command deck. No consensus. No clarity. Only doubt. And doubt spread faster than orders. They've lost unified interpretation, the intelligence officer observed on Ilara's bridge. Ilara nodded once. They're fracturing again. But this time, it wasn't from chaos. It was from overthinking. They're trying to predict every possibility, her second-in-command said. Yes. A pause. And in doing that, they've stopped acting entirely. That was the final step. Not breaking the enemy's structure. Not overwhelming their fleet, but paralyzing their decision-making. Advance, Ilara said. The human fleet moved forward, calm, controlled, inevitable. And still, no response. They're not firing, Tactical reported. They're waiting, someone else said. But waiting for what? The answer never came. Because there was no signal, no trigger, no moment where humanity revealed its true strategy. They simply kept moving. And that was what broke them. On coalition ships, tension reached its peak. Commanders stared at their displays, waiting for the hidden threat, the sudden shift, the inevitable betrayal of pattern. It never came. They're just advancing, an officer said, almost disbelieving. That's impossible, another replied. But it wasn't. And that made it worse. Because now, even normal behavior felt like a trap. They've redefined what threat looks like, the commander said slowly. A pause. We can't even trust a straightforward advance anymore. And that was it. The final realization. The moment the war became irreversible. Because when you can't trust the enemy's actions, you can't trust your own reactions either. On the resolute dawn, Ilara watched the coalition fleet remain frozen as human ships closed the distance. They've reached it, she said. Her second-in-command looked at her. Reached what? Ilara's voice was quiet. The point where every decision feels wrong. A beat. And when that happens, her gaze hardened. You stop making them. Across the battlefield, the coalition fleet, massive, powerful, fully armed, did nothing. No advance. No retreat. No attack. Just silence. And in that silence, humanity won. Not with firepower. Not with destruction. But with dominance. Total. Absolute. Unquestionable. They've already lost, the intelligence officer said softly. Ilara nodded. Yes. A pause. They just haven't accepted it yet. Outside, the human fleet continued forward, unchallenged, unstoppable. Not because the enemy couldn't fight, but because they no longer knew how. And across the galaxy, watching systems began to understand something far more terrifying than defeat. Humanity didn't just win battles. They removed the ability to fight back. The war didn't end with an explosion. It ended with silence. Across the galaxy, fleets that once moved with absolute precision now drifted in uncertain stillness. Command channels that once carried confident orders now echoed with hesitation, or nothing at all. Because no one knew what to say anymore. No one knew what would be right. On Viral Prime, the Galactic Council gathered for the final time during the war, not as rulers of a controlled galaxy, but as witnesses to its unraveling. They've stopped engaging, one counselor said quietly, reviewing the latest reports. Entire fleets are holding position indefinitely. They're waiting, another replied. For what? A third asked. No answer came. Because there was no longer a predictable moment to act. No safe decision. No reliable outcome. The laws they had written, the rules that had governed conflict for centuries, still existed. But they no longer meant anything. Human forces are advancing system by system, the observer reported. Minimal resistance. Most fleets withdraw before engagement or never engage at all. They're surrendering, someone asked. The observer hesitated. No. A pause. They're choosing not to fight. And that was worse. Because surrender implied defeat. This was avoidance. On the outskirts of a contested system, a coalition fleet commander stood on his bridge, staring at the incoming human formation. They were smaller, outnumbered, within range. Everything about the situation suggested one thing: attack. And yet, hold position, he ordered. No one questioned it, because every officer on that bridge was thinking the same thing. What if this is exactly what they want? Sensors scanned endlessly. No hidden signals. No unusual readings. No signs of deception. Just a straightforward human advance. And that made it unbearable. They're not doing anything, one officer whispered. They are, another replied. They're forcing us to decide. Minutes passed. Then more. The human fleet closed the distance. Still no reaction. Still no clarity. And finally, the commander spoke again. Stand down. Weapons powered down across the fleet. Not in defeat, in refusal. We will not engage, he said. And just like that, another battle ended without a single shot fired. On the resolute dawn, the moment registered quietly. They're standing down, the tactical officer reported. Alara Vance didn't look surprised. They've learned, she said. Her second-in-command leaned back slightly. Learned what? Ilara's eyes remained fixed on the silent fleet ahead. That fighting us doesn't just risk losing. A pause. It risks losing the ability to fight at all. And no civilization could afford that. Across the galaxy, the same pattern repeated. Fleets withdrew. Borders opened. Defensive lines dissolved. Not because humanity destroyed them, but because humanity had made conflict itself unstable, unreliable, unwinnable. On Viral Prime, the final session of the council reached its conclusion. The law, one counselor began, voice unsteady. Another finished it. Lost the war. Silence followed, because no one could deny it. They had tried to make war safer, cleaner, controlled. But in doing so, they had removed the only framework that allowed them to survive against something like humanity. They didn't break our system, the observer said quietly. A pause. They showed us it never worked against them. And that truth could not be undone. The official declaration came hours later, not broadcast with pride, not delivered with strength, but issued with quiet inevitability. The war was over. Humanity had achieved uncontested strategic dominance across all engaged sectors. No terms were negotiated, no conditions demanded, because none were needed. On the resolute dawn, the message arrived without ceremony. It's done, the communications officer said softly. Ilara closed her eyes for a brief moment, not in relief, in acknowledgement, because this had never been about victory. It had been about survival. And survival came at a cost. They'll rebuild, her second-in-command said. Ilara nodded. Yes. A pause. But they won't rebuild the same way. Because they couldn't. Not after this. The galaxy had learned something it could never unlearn. Rules could be used against you. Structure could trap you. Predictability could destroy you. And humanity had mastered all three. Ilara stepped forward, looking out at the quiet stars. They wanted to outlaw how we fight, she said softly. Her reflection stared back at her, calm, steady, unchanged. So we showed them why we fight that way. Behind her, the crew of the Resolute Dawn stood in silence, not celebrating, not cheering, because they understood. This wasn't a victory you celebrated. It was one you carried. Across the galaxy, new doctrines began to form, fragmented, uncertain, evolving. Some species abandoned strict formations entirely. Others tried to balance control with adaptability. None of them succeeded completely, because none of them were human. And that difference would define every war that came after. Far beyond the edge of the battlefield, a final transmission spread across open channels, simple, unencrypted, unmistakably human. Not a threat, not a warning, a statement. We don't break the rules because we want to. A pause. We break them because we have to survive. And that message reached every corner of the galaxy, every commander, every council, every future battlefield. Because the war had ended, but the lesson had just begun. If you made it this far into this HFY Global Tale story, you already know humanity doesn't win because it's stronger. It wins because it refuses to lose. And if that idea stayed with you, make sure you like the video, subscribe to HFY Global Tales, and share this story. Because out there in the dark, there are always more wars waiting, and humanity will always be ready.